Josh, welcome. We're glad you're able to join us today as well. So today, what I'm going to talk to you about is being purposeful. There's a quote that says, everyone ends up somewhere in life. Some end up there on purpose. And I want you to be not only a person of purpose, but an organization of purpose. And so with that, we're going to be tackling some of the major obstacles or barriers, if you will, to being purposeful, and specifically how to move from taking your data that you've got and making it actionable. I'll share some more stories along the way about my time as a city manager implementing this methodology in 2 different locations, some of the things that I saw, some of the barriers that I experienced, and then some of the strategies that I've taken that have been successful over time to help overcome that. So as we start here today, I want to start to listen to what you have to say. And specifically, what are your barriers to action? So we're going to do a little exercise here. If you could, use the chat box, and I'm going to tell you when to fire away, but as you think about your organization, having undertaken programmatic-based business intelligence, priority-based budgeting, how have you seen barriers pop up? And so what I want you to do is to type them into the chat box, and then when I say enter, go ahead and fire away. So think about that for a second. What obstacles or barriers have you seen? And then we'll put that in the chat. All right, is everybody ready? Okay, go ahead and hit enter. Let's see what kind of barriers you've got. All right. Oh, sweet. 2 solid ones. Wow, this is good. I'm going to be discussing those 2 today. So thank you for participating. Oh, there's a 3rd one. Don't have time. Too busy. Yeah. Anybody else have one? Okay. Good. These are perfect. We're all of one mind here. And so these are not uncommon. These are things that happen. Yep. Engagement with others outside the organization is another one. We'll touch on that too, and how to engage people, because that's a big part of communication. So moving along, barriers to action, and you guys hit a lot of these straight on. Communication. Now, maybe you've heard this in your organization, maybe not, but one of the questions I always heard was, where and how do we discuss our data? And we're going to talk about strategies for communication today. Then time. This is the big one I hear, not only when I was city manager, but working with clients now too, is, hey, this PBBI initiative has already taken enough of my time. I'm too lean. I don't have enough staff to do this. Can we just put this off for right now? And then Josh, just like you identified, analysis paralysis. We have so much information and data, I don't know where to start. And we're going to talk about that today. And then this last one is for anybody and everybody who touches and utilizes PBBI data in the first place, and that is, are you short on courage? And what I mean by that is moving from where you've been before with a line item budget to using priority-based budgeting, programmatic-based business intelligence requires leadership, and change requires leadership. Change is difficult. So a lot of things that we see are department directors, maybe even a city manager, county manager, who is afraid of difficult conversations, knowing full well change is necessary, but I just don't want to offend that person. Well, if we're afraid of offending somebody, that is a barrier to action. And we're going to talk about that today as well. So let's go ahead and let's start our journey of talking about how do we liberate our organizations. In other words, free our organizations up from these barriers to action. And provide some sort of new approaches, some new structures of meeting, conversing, relating, and engaging to one another. We'll start with communication. So communication. What does communication look like? Well, here's the thing that is very, very vital and important. The one thing that I've learned from both my implementations as a practitioner on the public sector side is this. If you're not talking about your data has no use whatsoever. Lots of organizations, including my first implementation, went through a long process, 18 months in my first one, and that was back in 2007 in Post Falls, Idaho, where we created our data. It took longer because we don't have the tools that we have now at ResourceX. We got done, and then the data sat on a shelf for a period of time because people just were weary, right? They were tired. They didn't know what, they were like, let's just get back to something different. But if we're not talking about our data, then, and whatever insights that you've created, then there's no way you're going to be able to be successful. One of the things that we know from psychology is this: we move in the direction of our conversation. So if we're not talking about insights, or what you'll hear me say a lot about today, the adjacent possible of what your organization could do with its programs and service delivery, with its data, then you're not going to move in that direction. So one of the things that I encourage organizations to think about are these: focused conversations. Now, I'm sure you've all sat in meetings before that are have a slew of things on an agenda. And sometimes talking about difficult conversations about data, about service delivery, gets pushed to the very end of the agenda as an afterthought, or as, if we have time, we'll get to that. I would concede to you, one of the most important things that you can do for your organization is to have a focused conversation. Have a meeting specifically to relate to your data, your programs, your information, so that that becomes the sole thing that everyone who's attending is thinking about, to be able to relate to the data, talk about it, and have what I call adult conversations about the future of a particular program. Just as important as that focused conversation is a regular cadence or a regular rhythm of meeting about it. Now, nobody likes meetings, right? And one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to think about a little bit later in this conversation today is this whole notion of minimalism. What can we do to free up, create the space, create a time that we can hold as sacred to actually have conversations about our programs and our data? That is also very important. Again, going back to where we stare is where we stray. If we can stare at our programs and we set up a time for our data that we're going to spend time with it, that becomes really important. Just as important of how frequently are we going to have these conversations about our data. So set a regular cadence for that. Lastly, this is important as well, because again, we know people, human nature is to come out against ideas that might seem oppositional to where we've been, the things that we've tried. And so it's really important that we create a safe space for people to be able to communicate their thoughts and ideas. So in other words, when you're having a meeting, set some ground rules. If we're going to be talking about our data, there are no bad ideas. We don't judge an idea that comes out of somebody's mouth and say, you know what, we tried that back in 1999 and it didn't work. Well, I've heard that 1,000 times too as a manager. Number one, typically it was never 1999. It was always sometime forward in the future. Different players, different circumstances, different data points even with our data. So we want to make sure that there are no bad ideas, that everyone is heard and everyone is respected with respect to ideas that get raised. So as we talk about meetings, make them focused, have them regularly, and ensure that there's safety so that people can participate. Further with communication, here are some thoughts too. Now, when you're talking about your data, again, like I said before, our conversations direct our actions. Well, we know this too. A problem or challenge cannot be met or resolved without a discussion of opportunities. And so there's this whole notion of changing the way in which we approach our questions and our challenges. And I would concede to you to consider appreciative questions. Appreciative questions are questions that aren't geared towards a root cause analysis. You know, hey, Eric, why'd you screw that up last week? How did we get to this point? That's all great. But what's more important is having a conversation that looks at discovery, In other words, what are our opportunities? Future looking, forward looking. What is our adjacent possibility, as I point number 2 here talks about? We have wicked problems facing our cities, counties, governments today. And the only way that we're going to be able to overcome them is to not do the finger pointing, not look at root cause analysis, where sometimes that's important. And as a struggling former engineer, I sometimes want to do root cause analysis, but I find that when we start to have conversations with our staff about why did this happen, when we start to use the question why, people's defenses go up. So let's have conversations about opportunity. As we think about discovery, looking at opportunities for appreciating questions that arise about how we can do things differently, about what those possibilities might be, we're going to be much, much further ahead. Here's a really simple exercise too. And initially, people look at you like you're nuts. And it's called the paradoxical question. In other words, I'm going to ask or challenge your organization with a particular problem to say, hey, for example, you might be trying to reimagine your police department. And you would say, what would we need to do to fail? And people are like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard somebody say. But it is an incredible exercise from the standpoint of, if we're going to act like we are able to cover the gamut of solutions, the gamut of possibility, we need to know what not to do as well. And so this exercise starts out really tough because people are thinking, I don't want to raise something that is negative or talking about failure. We don't want to fail. Of course, nobody wants to fail. But using the paradoxical question exercise to talk about what you would need to do to fail starts out kind of slow, but it starts to snowball because people said, well, if we didn't communicate well, if we remained in silos, like it was mentioned earlier on, like Santina said, siloed departments. Nobody has that problem, I'm sure. But if you did, one way to overcome that would be to talk about a list of ways to fail. And then when you get done with that exercise, you would say, let's look at this list that we've just created. Poor communication, siloed, lack of leadership, whatever those things come up in order to fail, you would ask yourself as an organization, are we doing any of these things today? If you are, simply stop it. Be conscious, be cognizant of the things that you're doing that are perpetuating or acting as a barrier for you to not be able to take action on your data. So it's really important to think about things from a different perspective. Now, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything today that maybe you already haven't thought of or already aren't doing as an organization, but come at it from a different angle. Again, thinking about failure to help you to be successful is a good place to start. Well, the next barrier that we are going to talk about is time. Here's the issue. Time does equal bandwidth. Again, one of the top things that we've heard from organizations and people is that we don't have time. This time issue can also be used as an excuse, though, too, for people that don't necessarily want to do the heavy lifting or the difficult work. Well, there are two things that come along with time. One of them is stress. Like this IT guy over here on the left side of my screen, he's like, oh my gosh, get me out of this meeting. I've got other stuff to do. I can't believe we're sitting here. So take a step back. As a leader, and again, I'm talking to all of you today because you are all a leader in one way or another. You don't have to necessarily have to be the CAO of your organization, Chief Appointed Officer. You are leading your organization to be better. Understand that stress from overwork is real. So, just like I challenged you earlier on today, what can you do to help free up time? Time spent on things that are important. You cannot meet the challenges of today using the methods of yesterday. You cannot divorce yourself from understanding that the most important thing that you can do as a leader in your organization is to create and hold space for important conversations. So again, as you go through your list of challenges that are facing your organization, look at those targets and then understand that you're going to move in the direction of your conversation. If you identified affordable housing, climate action, equity, whatever those topics may be, and say, these are our goals that we're going to be trying to accomplish, people are going to take notice and say that I'm going to have to start working to move in that direction. So the other thing that I've found in my career is resistance happens. People resist. Just like I said, with time equals bandwidth, there's resistance. I can't do this work. I don't have the time. I don't have the staff right now to do this. Well, when resistance occurs, don't do what I did in my early management career. And I was like, this person's resisting. I'm just going to have to work over them, around them. I can't work through them. That's the wrong approach. And while it would work for you in the short term, which it does, more importantly for us to understand is that resistance is an opportunity to just stop, listen to the person who's posting the resistance, because there may be a reason why that person is resisting, and learn from it. So invest that time in exploring what can we do to create a sustainable future. So most of the time, people are going to be really apt to want to listen to you if you listen to them first. So listen for those reasons of resistance and then say, okay, if I understand you correctly, I hear you say that you don't have the time and the staff does not have the ability right now to address this. What is your plan for ensuring that we have a sustainable future together? And so those are all questions that you might ask. And so it's working from a listening perspective to taking action just by, again, stopping, listening, and learning. All right. So time. Here's 3 ways to think about time as well. Intentionality. And as I've discussed already, meetings to discuss your data must be set with intentionality and purpose. So never go into a meeting without a clear objective or a purpose. And so as we talked earlier again about the challenges facing your organization, one of the things that becomes really important is to not clutter your meetings with multiple challenges. Set a meeting just to intentionally talk about equity in your organization or your community. Set a meeting to talk about policy level issues that you might want to take to your elected officials, but don't put multiple layers in there. Our brains are just not set up to be able to handle multiple challenges at one point in time. And so it's best to address with intentionality, one issue at a time. I've mentioned this already. This middle component of this slide talks about creating and holding space. And again, it is so vital for you to set the time to be able to have those conversations about your data and difficult topics. And one way you do that is this last side of the slide on the right, and that's to eliminate. We as in government, and I can say we because I've been there, being a city manager for over 20 years, was that government is great at adding new things, new programs, new meetings, new services, but we do a really poor job of eliminating things that just don't matter. I want to challenge you. Take a look at your calendar. Eliminate meetings if you can that don't matter. And even if you're coming at it, you're not the person that scheduled the meeting, posit this question. What if we took a break for 2 weeks from this particular meeting and we reallocated or repurposed that time to something else? At the end of 2 weeks, I would commit to coming back with all the players in this meeting, and let's just talk about what we missed, if anything. If you didn't miss anything, then you didn't really need that meeting. But this is a way in which we get away from the old ways of meeting. And we're going to talk about old ways of meeting in just a minute with a approach to relating to how we can free up time and use some different meeting structures to help us. But a lot of the meetings that we sit in today are report-ins. Somebody's giving a report on where they are, what they've done, what they've looked at, what they had for lunch yesterday, whatever. Or it's a meeting of, again, we're going to talk about in a few minutes, where there's little control for you to articulate important topics other than what was scheduled. And so I want to help you think about freeing up time to create the space for intentional meetings that deal with your data. And we're going to talk strategies here in just a second. So our next issue is paralysis of data. A lot of times organizations come to us and say, you know what? This has been an incredible process. It's been a sprint. to get to the point where we actually have our data. And I say, that's great. Then they say, but I don't know where to go now. I just got too much information. I'm not sure where to look. Well, there are several little strategies to think about. First and foremost, we have what we call the blueprint, the PBB blueprint. And I'm sure you've all seen this. If you haven't, we are more than happy to get this to you. But this use of the blueprint is a focusing of your team talking about how do we do two things. Number one, free up or reallocate resources. And number two, generate new resources to ensure that we move our programs forward. And so think about using the blueprint. It is an indispensable and valuable tool that can help your organization actually look at moving beyond paralysis and starting to talk about your data. And again, when you're paralyzed, the most important thing is not freeze up, stop talking, pushing other people away. It is trying to take a deep breath, getting your group together and talking about what is it specifically that you're trying to accomplish in the first place. What is your goal? What is the challenge that you're trying to overcome? And that can only happen through conversation. So one of the things that you're going to hear me say a lot today, that golden thread between all of these challenges or barriers really is about communication. Another strategy that you might consider using is jumping into your tools. Now, crazy as this may sound, and we just dealt with an organization yesterday, they have their data, they've had it done for a while, and they started to ask themselves, I don't even know what our programs are. These are department director level. I don't understand what our programs are. Well, have them spend time in the tools. Get their heads in the tools. Heads in tools equals more understanding of what you're looking at, what you're dealing with. Another strategy is what I call mining. At one point in time, I took a couple years off from my governmental career and worked for a mining manufacturing company. And so mining is pretty cool. But mining in this particular sense is this. Review the insights that you created during your implementation. And if you didn't create any, do it now. Now's the time to create those insights that are going to help you to, again, move your organization forward in a way that will hopefully be very positive from the standpoint of looking for small insights that could generate into a larger conversation about possibilities. Lastly, this is a go-to that I use all the time for organizations that are stuck, and that is simply this. Begin to revisit the basic program attributes with your programs. Somebody might already have a hunch that a program or service delivery might be able to change, but a good way to look at it again is just revisit those BPAs. Hey, let's talk about mandate for this program. Hey, let's talk about the reliance on us, our organization, to provide this particular service. Let's talk about cost recovery or whatever it might be. But again, the point is you're having a conversation about your data and you're using a piece of the tools that you've already went through that should feel familiar to your staff. Use that. Use these tools to help you. Next, I want to talk about courage and offense. And this is pretty important. So one of the things I hear from a lot of leaders and managers is they are afraid of offending anybody. But let me ask you this. I want you to have courage. Now, have you ever met with somebody and you're talking to them and they got something stuck in their teeth or something's hanging out of their nose, and you know the person, you work with them, you have a relationship with them? Let me ask you this. Did you actually stop them and say, hey, you got something in your teeth, you might want to get that? Well, again, this goes back to a bigger issue in society today, and that is our culture is afraid of offending people. We are a culture of offense. The smallest things offend people. There's a whole new term now of offense, aggressions, microaggressions, whatever that might be. But I'm going to tell you this. We cannot be afraid of offending people for something as important as our future together as an organization, being fiscally sustainable. If we're not fiscally sustainable, we're going to be in big trouble. So here are 3 points from my own perspective, and this is just me, but I hope it works for you as well. I would suggest that you grab the bull by the horns. You see something that needs to be done, be kind, be diplomatic, be bold, but be honest. The fact of the matter is, a lot of times we know that a particular program or data point in our organization isn't working and it needs to go away or needs to change. That's a big elephant in the room. And a lot of times some leaders don't want to tackle that. I'm going to suggest to you that you need to tackle it head on. Because if you don't have the courage, no courage, like I say here, equals death. And what I mean by that is this. We can continue to bleed because particular programs aren't working for our organization. And it's just a situation or a matter of time before change happens to your organization because you haven't taken action and been out front and forward looking to be able to address that. So have the courage. Being afraid to have difficult conversations and not having them may lead to your organization not surviving. So if you really care about your organization, which I know you all do, and you really care about the people that you're working with, the best thing to do is be honest, be bold, be diplomatic, but act. If we're not acting, we're going to be leading ourselves down a path to death as an organization. Lastly, most importantly here on afraid of offending is this. In our society today, we need to fight for relationships, not fight to be right. And a lot of times, that's a very difficult thing to do. As we're talking about programs and our data for our organizations, again, we need to have difficult conversations about it, but we don't necessarily want to offend somebody. My point is this. We need to fight for relationship. In other words, let's maintain a relationship with those that we work with, but being honest and having that conversation about the difficult programmatic nature of a data point that might exist. The future of service delivery. We don't want to tell Jimmy, who's worked here for 30 years, that his program is going to go away because he's had this for 30 years. You know what? Let's be honest. Let's have that conversation about how we can reallocate Jimmy's time. Maybe something different that will make him feel valued and still honored for his service and time. But we have to do this because we need to make sure that what we do for our citizenry, for our customers, our consumers of our services is relevant. And so have those difficult conversations, but when you do it, fight for relationship. In other words, maintaining positive relationships with one another. All right, moving forward here. Challenging the status quo. And I'm going to start talking about meetings now and how these meetings work or they don't work. The current method of meeting for a lot of organizations looks like this center circle where we have a pyramid, where usually some leader of an organization, department director, has a meeting, and the flow is usually down from the top of the pyramid. Now, this is not a good thing. Not a good thing at all, because that flow of information doesn't allow for information to come back up. And so as we look at this and think about it, there's 4 different topics here. Leadership. You know, challenges occur in every organization. The typical standard for addressing them is that you import some best practice from someplace else, or the leader who feels like they have to earn their title and their pay says, I've got a solution, and he implements that or she implements that from top down. Okay, that's status quo. Inclusion. As we think about when challenges arise, the traditional approach to solutions is to separate the people that decide what happens from those that do. In other words, again, it goes back to this pyramid where people at the top have a conversation and say, you know what, I'm going to come up with a solution that I want, you know, employees A through Z to do. And again, resistance is met with hours of other meetings, PowerPoint presentations, and workarounds. That's not true inclusion of people to help solve a problem. Government, specifically in the lower left-hand corner about failure and risk, the traditional municipal organization frowned upon employees taking risks. But the public doesn't want their government to fail either. So a lot of our organizations punish our people for taking risks, coming up with new ideas or thoughts about how to do things. And so this causes an avoidance of dealing with challenges head on. And then lastly, change. You know, the traditional logic is progress can only happen when you get big changes, right? Changing people, changing resources, changing macro structures. the reorganization. Let's just reorganize the entire structure of the organization and hope that we get that big change helps us. But all of those things with change are slow and tedious. So how do we overcome that? Well, one way we overcome that is looking at our meeting structure, and we look at how conventional meetings are run. So I want you to think about this. How are you running your meetings today? What's the elephant in the room for you in your organization? As you sit in meetings, are people bored, disengaged, feeling excluded, neglected? They don't get an opportunity to speak up? Well, I want to help you change that today through the use of what is readily known as liberating structures. So first and foremost, there are 4 things that I want you to think about as elements of a meeting. Element number 1 is control. And control. Do you think about how you set up your meetings? What's the invitation look like? How do you arrange your space? Who participates? Think about those things. I also really want you to think about this from a participation standpoint. Do you have the right people in the meeting? Think about that. Is it just the usual suspects that are in a meeting? Or are people who are really going to help you to deal with and face that challenge head on available as well? Next, think about the structure. What type of structure do you use? Are your meetings open discussion, brainstorm, presentations, status update, or a managed discussion? And the reason structure matters is that the way in which you structure your meeting kind of determines who gets to participate, who's in control, who participates, who is able to come up with a solution. And then lastly, this is important too. Every meeting should have an objective or a goal so that when you come out of that meeting, you actually are hitting a prescribed target. So we're going to talk about how framing meetings matters. So what's that look like? All right, so this is a simple XY axis. We're going to talk about the x-axis here, meaning engagement of people, how people are engaged. Obviously, you want to be to the right with engagement. On the y-axis, we're talking about who should be included in a meeting. And again, you want to include the most people in a meeting. So on the left-hand side, you see where these meetings land. Open discussion, yeah, it involves a lot of people, but it doesn't let people control the meeting at all. Same with brainstorm. It involves some people more than usual, but they still don't have control over ultimately the content. And then the other 3 meetings, as we call them the big 5, status update, presentation, managed discussion, they do very poorly on engaging everybody in helping with a solution. Conversely, liberating structures, which there are 33 strict ones, we've even created our own at ResourceX to help with facilitating better meetings. They do many things. Number 1, they disaggregate the control of the meeting, and they actually open up and invite more people in to help with a solution. So we're going to talk about liberating structures and how they might be able to help your organization. And then we'll give you a few examples, short examples of this tool on how you can utilize them in your organization. So as we think about liberating structures, one of the biggest goals is including everybody. So we talked about one of the challenges to the status quo is inclusion. Well, the goal with liberating structure is to make sure that more voices are heard. We want to unleash everyone and their ideas. We want to help break down silos. We want to invite the unusual suspects. Yeah. So this is what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at ways in which we can use new meeting structure to invite and include everybody. Here's this notion again of that status quo meeting, status quo structure, small change versus big change. And I will say this, don't try for the big changes. And you know what? I have been in this role as a city manager where I've been told, you better come up with some really big stuff here to help us out of this hole. But I found that when you go for the dino move, if you're a rock climber like Liz is in our organization, there's a risk and there's a high reward. There's a high risk too. If you go and you try to jump off and you're trying to grab the next boulder, if you miss, you're on the ground or you're going to hurt yourself. So a lot of times we as organizations need to be looking at how we can build on small changes that are impactful, that can be built upon, that success can be built upon to make sure that we're moving our organization forward. So small changes that equal big impact are the things that we want to make sure that we're doing with our organization. Failure. We talked about failure before and how nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to be a failure today. But we also know that there are, in many organizations, punishments for those who take risks. Well, I want you to think about taking risks safely, encourage experiments. And how do we do this? Well, we actually look into doing what we call a retrospective or a debrief, where we learn from our mistakes. We need to make it safe to speak up. We need to make it safe for our organizations to take calculated risks. Next, I want you to think again about the adjacent possible. And that is, let's focus on what's working well, but let's also focus on what we can do within our power today with the resources that we've got right now to do things differently. It's about acting on the future. And again, this is what this whole webinar today is about. We've got data that has insights that could be actionable, but if we're not thinking about how we can apply the data and doing things differently, the way we deploy our services, we're not going to be thinking about tomorrow or having a change. Think about your resources you have right now to create a better tomorrow today. All right, local solutions. This is great. There's no need for consultants with liberating structures unless you want to hire us to help you. Kidding aside, this really respects people. One of the things that I found in my managerial career as a leader was that every time a problem arose, I was apt to bring in a consultant, right, to try to help. And while that's great to see a person come in with a briefcase and tell you what you're doing wrong, it really is sort of disrespectful to your staff. Disrespectful for the standpoint that, have you taken the time to ask them to help you overcome a problem or challenge that could be dealt with locally? So the biggest thing that you can do as a leader is respect your people, is to engage them, include them, hear their voice to help you resolve a challenge. And liberating structures help with that. And then lastly is this: if you have barriers, don't ignore them. Your job as a leader is to not ignore that barrier, but make it easier for your people. Remove them. And one of the things that we do here at Resource X, and I encourage you to do this as well. I do this in my own home, and it bugs my daughter to no end. What's keeping you from doing the best work of your life? What's keeping your staff from doing great work? I will guarantee you, if you have a meeting on just talking about barriers, you will be shocked and amazed when people say, you know what, we could do a whole lot better job of whatever if these barriers weren't there. And that in and of itself will lead to conversations about programs and service delivery that could open up doors for your success as an organization. So talk about barriers. Ask people, what's limiting you? What's stopping you from making changes? What's stopping us as an organization from transformationally changing the way in which we provide law enforcement, changing the way in which we are addressing any of a number of challenges that you're being faced with today? So as we talk about liberating structures, there are, again, a gamut of them, but these are some of the winners from our perspective that you could use in your organization to be successful. The first one is simple as this. It's called the W3. It's asking the question, what? So what? Now what? You can use this as a great look back on the progress that you've made on a particular project or initiative, and it is super helpful because it allows for people to voice their understanding, number one, of what you've just done. So let's just use the implementation of programmatic-based business intelligence or priority-based budgeting, for example. As you think back and you just went through an implementation, you ask yourself, what did we just do? And people should be able to articulate, well, we created a program inventory, we costed it, we scored it, we came up with insights, whatever. It's important for that people to understand where they've come from. That's the what question. Marco Rubio moment, drinking some water. Next is so what? Okay, so we've created this data, we've done this, so what? What does it mean? What what can you identify just from going through the particular project or exercise that was meaningful? Are you starting to see patterns? Do we see any insights from this work that we've already done? For example, the second time they implemented PBB in Inglewood, Colorado, I had asked this, not knowing at the time that it was called Liberating Structure. What did we do? What did we find out? People were like, man, this is great. I noticed that we have all these departments doing the same function, the same program. Maybe we can eliminate it. There's an insight that could lead to action. And it did in several instances. In that instance, it was we had several departments doing their own equipment maintenance, multiple departments doing IT. Why do we have multiple departments doing IT? Why do we have 7 out of 11 departments cutting grass in our city? Crazy. But we wouldn't have known that if we don't go through the exercise of talking about our data, talking about our programs. All right, so now that you've done what, so what, the most important question is now what? What are we going to do about it? Where are we going to go from here to change the way in which we found these insights? What are our possibilities? So that's a great exercise to use. And it's so simple. Again, the goal is invite the right people in, allow each person to speak, allow each person to participate, to come up with solutions to a challenge to make sure that you're better tomorrow than you were yesterday. Next is a 15% solution. And maybe you've heard of 15% solutions before. Google and 3M were really big at creating this, where they allow their employees to think outside the box of taking some time to create new methods and new products. But in this particular instance, I want you to think about 15% solutions this way. And it is simply framing a meeting, inviting people into a meeting and say, all right, guys, what is it that we could do today with no new resources, no new time, that we could do differently? And it gives people the freedom or autonomy to actually think about innovating the way in which products or services are delivered in your organization. And it requires no council decision. It might not even require a city or county manager's permission to do it. Use 15% solutions to really come up with some great ideas about innovation, about things that you're currently doing, the way in which they can be done better. This gets at the heart of including the last slide's question of what barriers exist for those employees to not be able to implement a 15% solution. Think about it from that perspective. Now this next one, 1, 2, 4, all, is really helpful and useful as well about engaging everybody simultaneously to generate questions, ideas, or thoughts when you're stuck. And it's so good to use for ideation on programs. And so, for example, you can string these together as well. So you've gone through the W3 exercise, what, so what, now what, and people come up with the now what, and we're like, well, we got to take action on the fact that we've got multiple departments that are doing IT, grass cutting, whatever it might be. This is where 1, 2, 4, all can come in. And how it works is this way. You would look at that now what list and say, all right, guys, here's the now what list. I want you individually to come up with ideas to address the now what's. Then you would go in and say, all right, guys, pair up with somebody. And I want you to compare ideas that you came up with to address how we're going to address the now what list. And then you get into a bigger group. And ultimately, you get into a group where the whole room is engaged and you share your solutions for addressing the now what, or you share a solution for whatever the challenge or problem is that you're trying to overcome. 1, 2, 4, all, again, super easy, very quick, very simple to administer. You don't have to be a rocket science to do it. Lastly is minimum specifications, or min specs. I know they use a mushroom, which is kind of goofy. I think hippies actually created these things, but quite frankly, I don't care who invented these structures, they work because they engage everybody, they include it, everybody's voice is heard. It works really well. So how this works is this. This is really helpful in using this way, and that is this. If you're trying to figure out what are the minimum things that we need to do or the things that we don't need to do to address a challenge, it is essential to determine what the purpose is of a program or initiative going forward. Use this to evaluate your programs for change, for example. Let's just say you've got an idea or thought about changing a program. You know, we're gonna reimagine our police department, and we're gonna strip out our police officers from having to deal with homeless people. We're gonna strip out them having to deal with mental health patients, mental health individuals. How are we gonna do that? Well, minimum specifications would suggest that you talk about the minimum things we're gonna do and the minimum things we're not going to do, and who needs to be involved. It is so great. This is another easy exercise to do to help you boil down to the essential purpose of change and addressing a challenge. A great way to use this is to look at opportunities for change and creating your own min specs to be able to achieve that goal. Next, I'm going to talk about the tool called the retrospective. And the retrospective is really, again, looking backwards at something that you've just done to try to make it better for the future. We use retrospectives pretty often at ResourceX internally to help address how we've just done with a particular initiative or a client engagement, because we're looking at trying to be better. And I would suggest to you as cities and counties, this is something to think about as well, and to think about things that we should start if we're not doing it already. Examining your data, what you need to do to start. Well, this is a good way to look back. Again, we've created a data, PBB data. How are we going to deal with it? Well, let's start looking at it. Let's start carving out the time to do it. What do we need to stop? And this is asking yourselves this question is, what do we need to stop doing with our data? Continue. What do we need to continue? What programs should continue? What programs do we need to do more of? What programs do we need to do less of? Now, that's probably where you're going to spend a lot of your time camped out, talking internally about the ramifications of stopping to do something. But it is, again, vitally important that when you go through a project to be able to look back and understand, start, stop, continue more or less to help you to be better next time. Better next time. That's the whole goal of a retrospective. The last exercise I'm going to leave you with today is called the 3W, not to be confused with W3. This one is, again, a very useful structure for looking at going from idea, strategy creation, to strategy doing. Again, one of the big things that we preach, we are evangelistic about this, is we don't want you just to create data. We want you to use your data, and this will help you to do it. So you go through the process of implementing PBB, you've got your data, even if you've created it several years ago, this still applies to you today. You sit down with your team and you say, what could we do? What could we do? Again, looking just at the resources we have, what could be done to bring about transformational change? You spend time talking about what you could do, and then you move then to what should we do? And that process is looking back at the list of things that you've just written down to say, these are the things we could do. Looking at that, not everything can be done on that list, right? Not everything might be in alignment too with your challenge or your community results or your strategies as a elected body. Might say, well, that doesn't align with that. But go through that process there and say, what should we do? So now you're moving from idea to something more concrete. Then lastly, not lastly, but next to last is, what will we do? This then becomes the jumping off point for doing. Again, I want your organization to be purposeful and intentional about moving from idea to action. And what will we do begins to say, these are the things that we're going to commit to. This is where accountability starts to set in here, ladies and gentlemen, with this particular phase. And that's taking that what should we do list to here is what we are going to do. Then this becomes a simple conversation with your elected body, with your organization to say, you know what, we thought about this challenge. Again, common challenges, creating greater equity in our community, creating affordable housing, whatever that might be. We've gone through what we could do, what we should do. Here is what we will do. And very powerful process to go through that will lead to you helping you get that transformational change you're seeking. Then lastly here, I want you to think again about retrospectives, looking back with a regular cadence again. How have we done with this, what we will do? How are we doing with what we committed that we were going to do? So again, this again helps you with action, but it also helps with accountability. But it's not accountability from the standpoint of, you know, Eric, why didn't you complete this? It is talking about barriers. It's talking about all the things that we've talked about today. How are we leading? How are we meeting? How are we moving forward? Who are we including to help get things done, these solutions done? So it's could we, should we, will, looking back, making sure that we're accomplishing what we need to do in a very positive format, so that you can celebrate your success and you can move forward as an organization into your next challenge. All right, so as we talked about today, action is your goal. Again, data, moving to insights, moving to action, strategically to act on your data. Well, guys, I want to go to questions now if anybody has questions. But again, so appreciate your time today. I am always available as the VP of Client Success with ResourceX to be a resource for you. But if you need help in your organization with identifying those barriers, trying to overcome those barriers to taking action, we've got the tools and resources. This today was just a macro look at addressing some of the micro problems that you might have in your organization with taking action. So thank you. Does anybody have any questions today? Don't be bashful. You can come off mute if you'd like. Does this resonate with anybody? Was this helpful for you and your organization? Yeah, thanks, Troy. Appreciate that. Yeah, cool. And again, these structures, these methods are easy to find. And I will say this, if you are interested in learning more about liberating structures, the nice thing is they are an open source organization. Everything that they have is free, is online. You can go to liberatingstructures.com and you will see the entire alphabet of opportunity for you as your organization to use these new macro structures to help with your meetings. And I would encourage it. So powerful to think about changing the way you meet. And it sounds really strange to change the way you meet, but if you do, your conversations could be so much more rich. Your outcome could be so much better, so much more powerful by just changing the way in which you communicate, the way in which you have courage, the way in which you engage with your staff and engage with others to accomplish the main goal of taking action on your data. All right, guys, thank you so much today for joining us. Again, if you ever need anything, please feel free to reach out. I would love to be able to converse with you and help you to be successful. Thanks again.